together with you today. I wanted to start with a statistic that I think a lot of Americans may be familiar with either personally or from having seen some of the data, but we know that more than 2.7 million children in America are being raised by grandparents or next of kin. They are among our nation's unsung heroes. They are, in so many ways, a light in the darkness. They've made sure that their grandchildren are both loved and supported, even in the most trying of circumstances. And of course, COVID-19 has been among the most difficult chapters in American history. For so many American families, this pandemic has been among the most darkest and trying of times. As we'll hear today in our hearing, grandparents who are raising their grandchildren have become increasingly isolated throughout the pandemic. Grandchildren lived in fear that they might contract the virus and spread it to aging grandparents. And tragically, at least 140,000 children, 140,000 children were orphaned by the pandemic and are now living with grandparents or next of kin as a result. Sadly, this staggering number is almost surely an undercount. The American Rescue Plan invested $30 million to increase mental health awareness among young people, including members of grandfamilies. Those dollars also were used to train school personnel to respond to these types of concerns. Thankfully, grandfamilies are a topic of longstanding bipartisan interest in this committee, as well as action by this committee. We'll continue that tradition with today's hearing and the policy we'll talk about. In 2018, Senator Collins, she was then the chair of the committee, she and I worked to pass legislation to establish a national advisory council to support grandfamilies and kin caregivers. We will build on this legacy by introducing the Supporting the Well-Being and Mental Health of Grandfamilies Act to extend the advisory council for an additional 4 years. This council has been successful because it incorporates the voices of grandparents, grandfamilies in its membership and its mission. At today's hearing, the committee will have an opportunity to hear from 2 grandparents, Ms. Ruth Stevens from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and also Ms. Gail Engel from the state of Colorado. Now, like so many in this room and others listening, I've got a grandson, and I've got a grandchild on the way in July. So I know what I would do, and what I would do is anything to support him if his parents couldn't. And I know every grandparent has that same feeling of love and that same feeling of commitment to their grandchildren. Both Ruth Stevens and Gail Engel will share the blessings and the challenges they have experienced in raising their grandchildren. In this case, Tamir and Bryson, who are both with us today. Ms. Stevens fought to bring her grandson home after he was placed in foster care without her knowledge. Families like hers save taxpayers an estimated $4 billion each year in costs. Yet approximately 1 in 5 grandfamilies live at or below the federal poverty line. And nearly half of all grandmother-only households are living in poverty. That is unacceptable and should be unacceptable to any member of the United States Congress. I've fought a lot of battles to strengthen support for these families. Today, I'm reintroducing the Grandfamilies Act, which will lower costs for grandfamilies by increasing access to both Social Security and temporary assistance to needy families support, those benefits, I should say. I'm also reintroducing the bipartisan Informing Grandfamilies Act, that's Senate Bill 4443, alongside Senator Young to ensure that TANF eligible, temporary assistance for needy families eligible, grandfamilies are aware of and can access all of the benefits for which they qualify. I want to thank Ranking Member Scott for his support on this bill, as well as Senator Kelly, a member of our committee, for both supporting this bill. Tim, thank you for that. So I look forward to today's hearing and our witnesses and their stories and their experiences about what more Congress can do to support our nation's grand families. And with that, I'll turn to our ranking member, Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for investing your time, your energy, and your expertise in such an important subject. Grandparents and other relatives raising children save the child welfare system about $4 billion a year in costs related to supports and services for children. Kids raised by kin do better in life than those placed in foster care. While I was not raised by my grandparents, I certainly had a lot of experience with my grandparents as a youngster. When my parents divorced when I was about 7 years old, we moved into my grandparents' house. It was certainly one of the houses that Chairman Casey just described as living at the poverty line or slightly below the poverty line. The house was filled with lots of love, discipline, and encouragement, but not a lot of resources. So when we think about the importance that the grandparents play in the lives of the kids that are in that household, it is undeniable that the child is infinitely better off with the kinfolk, so to speak, than they are in foster care. We wish we had more of those opportunities in this country today to see those loving kids in foster care, hopefully in loving homes, be in homes where they are related to the ones who are taking care of them. And I thank you all for, especially the two grandparents who've had that experience yourselves, for being a part of the panel and having that discussion with us and the important role that that plays in the lives of the grandchildren, but also the important role that the grandchildren play in your lives. I know that one of the important lessons that I received, most of the important lessons I received in life, some of it came from my academic education, but most of it came from my household. Most of it came from my grandparents and my mother. And I'm so thankful to have had that opportunity to move with my grandfather and my grandmother, because he really taught me the value of education and the necessity of perseverance, the necessity of patience, the necessity of hard work, discipline, and frankly, being on time, though I was about 60 seconds late for this hearing. I'm still learning the lessons from my grandfather. He would also agree with that. But when you think about the households that are at that poverty line in today's economy, where gas is 49% higher than it was just several months ago, 100% higher than it was 18 months ago, you think to yourself, what are the challenges of raising the second generation of kids, too often on fixed incomes? You think and you ask yourself, clothing is up over 10%, baby food over 13%, the scarcity of baby formula. There's, without question, a serious challenge for those households who are already at the poverty line, trying to meet the needs of their loved ones. Grandparents raising grandchildren are absolutely a necessity, and we should do everything in our power to provide more light to the problems and more solutions as well. Back in 2018, I joined our former chairman, Senator Collins, and our current chairman, Senator Casey, in introducing legislation to establish the Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Advisory Council, which submitted its recommendations to Congress last November. I joined Chairman Casey, as he just said, and Senator Young in taking part of the important implementation through the Informing Grandfamilies Act. South Carolina is a leader in elevating the role of grandparents raising grandchildren. South Carolina's Department of Social Services employs kinship navigators to help these caregivers negotiate the complex web of benefits and supports for which they may be eligible. DSS has also implemented provisional licensing of kinship caregivers. Provisional licensing makes the kinship caregivers eligible for economic supports otherwise only available to traditional foster parents. As a result, 21% of placements today are to kin caregivers, up from just 5% 3 years ago. That's really good news. To encourage all states to make these kinds of reforms, I have also introduced the Child Care Development Block Grant Reauthorization Act, which would make children in kinship care and parents 65 years or older eligible regardless of income or work requirements. I look forward to learning as much as possible from the witnesses today, and I thank you for sharing your stories and your expertise as it relates to this very important topic. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. As many of the witnesses know and those listening, we'll have senators who will be in and out. Thursday is a busy morning in terms of hearings and votes, and we'll have votes at 11 o'clock, so we'll have to do some juggling. But one of the senators joining us already is Senator Rick Scott. We're grateful he's with us. Let me move to the next part of our program, which is to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Donna Butts. She's the Executive Director of Generations United. Generations United is the thought and action leader on issues relating to kinship care in the United States. For our second witness, I'll turn to Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kim Clifton helps South Carolinian grandparents raising grandchildren navigate the resources and benefits available to them. She is Executive Director of HALOS, which stands for Helping and Lending Outreach Support. The HALOS Kinship Care Program promotes safe and nurturing homes for children in kinship care through these ways: by connecting caregivers to resources and benefits, including legal services, helping caregivers navigate complicated bureaucratic systems, and offering annual family respite, monthly caregiving support groups, and educational opportunities. Kim holds a Master of Social Work degree from Boston University. Her previous experience includes working with women and children at risk in places as diverse as Washington State, Boston, and Guatemala. She is a member of the Sisters of Charity Foundation's statewide Kinship Advisory Council and the South Carolina Department of Social Services Kinship Advisory Panel. Kim's leadership has established HALOS as a model for the entire state of South Carolina and achieved great recognition. During her tenure, HALOS won the Aaron Hardwick Award for Nonprofit Governance from Together SC, South Carolina statewide association of over 700 charitable, nonprofit, and philanthropic organizations. We look forward to her testimony, and we thank you for your expertise and your investment of your energy, your time, and your expertise to South Carolina's most vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. Our third witness is Ms. Gail Engel, joined by her grandson, Bryson. Ms. Engel is a grandparent caregiver who has dedicated her life to supporting her own family and grandfamilies in her community. She founded Grand Family Coalition, an organization based in Fort Collins, Colorado, dedicated to providing support to grandfamilies in the community. Ms. Engel, we're grateful you're here with us. And our fourth and final witness, as I mentioned earlier in my opening, is Ms. Ruth Stevens. She's joined by her grandson, Tamir. She's from Philadelphia in my home state of Pennsylvania, and she fought to bring her grandson out of foster care and to bring him home with her. She has raised her grandson since he was an infant and will share their story with us today. So we'll start with our first witness for an opening statement. Ms. Butts, you may begin your statement.
Thank you. Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for your commitment to families and the opportunity today to talk with you about grandparents and other relatives raising children, also known as grandfamilies or kinship families. My name is Donna Butts, and I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of Generations United. Generations United's mission is to improve the lives of children, youth, and older adults through intergenerational collaboration, public policies, and programs for the enduring benefit of all. For almost 25 years, Generations United has run the National Center on Grandfamilies, which has been a leading voice for issues affecting these families. Recently, along with national partners, we're also running the first ever National Technical Assistance Center on Grandfamilies and Kinship Families, known as the Grandfamilies and Kinship Support Network. Families are the cornerstone of our neighborhoods, towns, and cities. Regardless of political affiliation, families and their well-being unites us. When parents are unable to raise their children, grandparents and extended family step up and wrap children in the cocoon, the protective cocoon of family, providing roots and connection to culture, keeping siblings under one roof, and showering children with the one thing money cannot buy, love. Currently, more than 2.7 million children benefit from the contributions of grandparents, other relatives, or close family friends, and they thrive in this loving care. Caregivers may step into this role for a host of reasons, including most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. Whatever the reason, the caregivers often sacrifice dreams of their own, a carefree retirement, travel, dates with friends, and instead invest their hope for the future in the children they never planned to raise. They cannot and should not have to do this alone and without our support. We are grateful for the important actions the Special Committee on Aging has taken to support the families, and thank you for understanding there is still more to be accomplished on their behalf. The vast majority of children raised by relatives are cared for by grandparents. These family heroes face tremendous challenges stepping into the role of parent. Approximately 1 in 4 have a disability, and 48% are 60 or older. Grandfamilies face challenges accessing necessities like health care, affordable housing, educational supports, and nutrition assistance. They often neglect their own health and mental health, prioritizing the children's needs. Despite these challenges, they play a unique and vital role in providing safe, stable, and permanent homes for children. When they cannot be raised by their parents, children do best with relatives. Compared to children in foster care with non-relatives, children with relatives have a more stable and safe childhood, better behavioral and mental health outcomes, and are more likely to report always feeling loved. However, because the vast majority of children in grandfamilies are outside of the foster care system, these families are less likely to get access to services. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on grandfamilies and is contributing to their numbers, as Senator Casey said, 140,000 new orphans in our country. Grandfamilies that formed prior to the pandemic have found that their challenges have been heightened and are facing struggles and mental health issues, stress, isolation, and from what we are seeing anecdotally, an increase in death by suicide. Thanks to the leadership of this committee, 2 bold new federal initiatives are beginning to make a difference in the lives of grandfamilies. The Federal Advisory Council to support grandparents raising grandchildren, and the Grandfamilies Support Network. On behalf of the families, our partners, and others who care deeply about grandfamilies and kinship families, Generations United thanks Congress for supporting these initiatives. While progress has been made, there is much to be done. Generations United recommends the following: implement the recommendations of the Federal Advisory Council to support grandparents raising grandchildren. Ensure legislation continues to promote the engagement of grandfamily voices. Urge states to use the National Family Caregiver Support Program to serve grandfamilies. Support quality kinship navigator programs. Ensure adequate financial support for grandfamilies to meet basic needs by increasing and improving access to temporary assistance for needy family child-only grants, family foster care maintenance payments, and Social Security to better meet the needs of grandfamilies. Invest in and encourage greater availability and access to quality, trauma-informed mental health providers that are familiar with grandfamilies. Create a child-only SNAP benefit and ensure automatic access to free and reduced school meals. Facilitate the expansion of specially designed grandfamilies housing. Generations United is proud to endorse the Informing Grandfamilies Act, the Grandfamilies Act, and the Supporting the Well-Being and Mental Health of Grandfamilies Act. Together, these will help address some of the issues and recommendations outlined in my testimony. Most grandparent caregivers say they never saw themselves raising another generation of children, yet they step up, and despite complicated systems, hurdles, and hardships, they provide the loving homes in which children can thrive. But they cannot and should not have to do this alone. Collectively, they save our country more than $4 billion a year by keeping children connected to their roots and out of foster care. They're doing the very best they can, and they deserve our best. We should not expect them to fit into systems and services designed for other families, but instead create connecting pathways that respect their unique and complex circumstances. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of Generations United and the Grandfamilies we believe in and support.
Ms. Butts, thanks for your testimony and bringing your experience to the hearing. I want to acknowledge two members of our committee who have joined us, Senator Warnock and Senator Blumenthal. Next, we'll turn to Ms. Clifton for her opening statement.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on Grandfamilies. On behalf of HALOS and the Grandfamilies in our program, I'm honored to provide this testimony. HALOS's mission is to promote safe and nurturing homes for children in kinship care. We provide navigation services, support groups, and other programs to grandparents and other kinship caregivers. Currently, there are an estimated 67,000 children living in kinship care in South Carolina. And for every one child in kinship foster care, there are 164 children who live with relatives outside of the foster care system. First, I want to tell you about Erica. When her daughter was not able to care for her own children safely, Erica, a 65-year-old retiree, welcomed her grandson and granddaughter into her home. She said, "I prayed to God to help me provide for my grandchildren, and HALOS saved us. We had nowhere to go." Erica, like most grandparents, stepped in before her grandchildren were taken into custody. As a result, Erica is not entitled to the benefits foster parents receive, such as case management services, training, and financial stipends. Erica and other kinship caregivers do what they do selflessly, driven by the desire to keep their grandchildren in the family. They seldom have time to think of the cost to themselves emotionally, physically, and financially. "I didn't want my babies to go into foster care," is what we hear time and again when grandparents explain why they're raising their grandchildren. HALOS fills the gap by connecting caregivers to essential resources for themselves and the children in their care. Access to navigation programs like HALOS varies by locale. Title 4B kinship navigation funds aren't adequate to meet the needs for services. Moreover, the funds are appropriated annually, making it difficult for states and service providers to develop long-term strategies for serving grandfamilies. 8-year-old Justin experienced physical abuse, neglect, and abandonment before living with his great-grandmother, Martha. Like most kinship caregivers, Martha did not understand the effects of trauma on children. She loved Justin, and she was determined to keep him with her, but she didn't know how to help him deal with his anger and his violent outburst. We connected Martha with trauma-informed mental health and child advocacy services for Justin, and we referred her to the Trident Area Agency on Aging for respite care for herself. Martha and Justin were lucky. Our local area agency on aging utilizes funds from the National Caregiver Support Program to support grandfamilies. Not all of them do. During the pandemic, we saw a dramatic increase in requests for financial assistance because caregivers were furloughed, laid off, or forced to quit jobs due to lack of child care. Hannah, a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren, worked as a school janitor before COVID. When schools shut down, Hannah lost her job. When Hannah reached out to HALOS for help paying rent, she said, "I've never had to ask anyone for help. I raised my kids and now my grandkids, and I've worked all my life." HALOS provided Hannah with rental assistance and food resources. Hannah's family, like many during COVID, experienced food insecurity for the first time. Hannah's assistance was among the $450,000 in emergency financial aid we distributed from public and private sources. Those funds helped mitigate the effects of the pandemic for kinship families, but those funds are now drying up. The return to work has not solved the poverty faced by most grandfamilies. They need financial assistance to survive. HALOS has served over 900 families since 2019, and 80% of these families fall below 200% of the federal poverty level. Programs meant to assist people with critical needs of healthcare, financial assistance, and food are lifelines for our families, but they can be challenging to navigate. As COVID-related Medicaid and enhanced SNAP benefits end, access to food and healthcare for many of our families are at risk. Additionally, affordable child care is not accessible by most kinship families, particularly those outside of the foster care system. Inclusion of kinship families and those receiving child care assistance would assure that caregivers can continue working or have much-needed respite time, knowing that the children in their care are safe. Grandparents step in because they love their grandchildren, but they need support. Navigation programs need to be consistently available throughout every state. Grandparents often neglect their own care to ensure that the children have what they need, that their grandchildren have what they need. They need respite and access to health and mental health services. Policy, services, and systems that touch kinship families should ensure that they remove barriers to access for kinship caregivers so that all children, including the nearly 3 million in kinship care across the nation, can flourish.
Thanks very much for your testimony, Ms. Clifton. We'll now turn to Ms. Engel for her opening statement.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Thank you for allowing me to share my story and my perspective. It is an honor to be here. My name is Gail Engel. My husband and I raised our grandson since he was a year old. We later adopted him, now 15, and co-parenting our 14-year-old granddaughter. Our daughter experienced trauma as a child by a father who suffered from his own mental health issues. I didn't place trauma on my child. We experienced it together. Yet the guilt, shame, stigma kept me from seeking help. Our daughter suffered from physical and mental health problems that she was not able to overcome. Just a single mother of 2 children, one of whom had challenging behaviors and has lived in poverty, her ability to adequately care for the children and fear of child welfare involvement, we stepped in. Raising a child a second time around has many challenges: physical, social, emotional, and financial. At the age of 52, I was already caring for my aging mother. We felt alone and lost contact with friends. The physical demands, such as being able to teach a child how to ride a bike with 2 knee replacements, was impossible. Many times we ask ourselves, can we do this? The cost of raising a child not only not allowed us to retire, the funds put aside for retirement may not sustain us through the age of 82, a mere 15 years away. With a diagnosis of autism, IDD, cognitive function disorder, after adopting him, we were able to collect Social Security supplemental income to help us financially. Children with trauma and developmental delays are often unable to access the part of the brain needed to learn, and often with a fight or flight response to the disciplinary actions. Schools are most often ill-prepared with specialized training to support these youth. My grandson has suffered unnecessarily due to the continuous punitive punishment and being labeled as a behavior child. Having to pay out of pocket to get medical diagnosis, we were finally able to be able to advocate for an IEP, individualized education plan. Even at that, the inadequate trained staff, services, and supports, his emotional well-being and education has suffered dramatically. Having to educate myself to seek out resources that were mostly non-existent, I discovered my own small community that there were over 3,000 grandparents raising grandchildren. I found myself struggling just as they were, and now serve over 140 families. Building upon my own experience, I built a community of grandparents and other kin raising kin by creating a place where grandfamilies and services connect. Grand Family Coalition was created out of my own need to survive. It should not be ignored that aging has its own challenges, and grandparents are taking on an additional role, often taking on grandparents with little warning and often returning to workforce to maintain stability for the long haul of raising children to adulthood. Often winding up in significant legal expenses to retain legal responsibility of the children, they often isolate and avoid judgment, guilt, and shame, and experience a secondary trauma. They most often complex systems that find resources that are often lacking and inadequate. Grandfamilies are stepping up while the world is unaware of their complexities or even their existence. Grand Family Coalition relies on grants, donations, and volunteer staff to support our mission. We also know the need for our support is in every community. Other small nonprofits such as Grand Family Coalition have the experience and knowledge to support grand families. However, due to limited funding, they struggle to take root. We need funding to expand the work to reach to the compensate for their efforts. My ask would be to encourage collaboration among the many systems that are responsible for assisting children and families so that more dollars can be put in the hands of small nonprofits so that they can do the beneficial work for grand and kinship families. Thank you.
Ms. Engel, thanks for your testimony. We'll now turn to our fourth and final witness, Ms. Stevens.
Good morning, Chairman Casey.
Ms. Stevens, maybe we'll just check to make sure your mic is on.
Okay, good.
Is that
My
on?
name is Ruth Stevens. I am 75 years old. I was born in North Philadelphia, and I grew up in the same community I live in now. I have two biological children, a daughter and a son. My grandson, Tommy, is here with me today. I have always loved taking care of children, and I hate to see them unhappy. I raised more than 10 children who were not my own. It's very dangerous on the streets of North Philadelphia, and every child that I have taken care of graduated school, stayed off drugs while they lived with me. I taught the children how to ride a bicycle, read, take care of themselves. I went with them on trips. No matter what I had to do, I made sure I was with them to their activities and that they knew they had someone who cared. When my grandson, Tamir, was born, I found out that he was placed in foster care with a white family in Northumberland, PA, who I keep in touch with today, and they wanted to adopt him. Tamir is my grandson, and he needed to be with me. I took the train, which was about 3.5 hours from Philadelphia, to see the family a few times, trying to get him through legal support. A community member told me about Senior Law Center and shared that they may be able to help me. It took about a month, and I was eventually able to bring Tamir home with me. He was about 8 weeks old. I had to do what I had to do to get my grandchild out of foster care. It was not easy. Tamir was on a breathing machine, an oxygen machine, an asthma machine, and he needed a lot of support. I was 50 years old when I got him, and it was not easy. I did not drive. I brought him to all his medical appointments on the bus or train. I got help from different programs in the community. I was on public assistance. I received a small check to take care of him. We struggled for a while. He was able to get on until he was able to get on disability insurance. A community member told me about Temple University Friends program, where I connected with other grandparents. Family and Friends is a program based at Temple University that provides support to grandparents and kinship families in Philadelphia who have taken on the role of primary caregiver for related children and special needs. The program serves 160 families and children annually. With the Temple program, I received a lot of support. We met once a month before COVID as a support group to help address issues of stress and isolation, the grandparents and kinship members. We went on trips They connected us to resources in the city. I always had somewhere to take Tamir during COVID. We were not able to get together or have the activities. It was difficult. We do have a trip coming up at an amusement park, and Tamir and I will go on that trip. Tamir's mentor from Temple program took him to play basketball, and they went to get games together. His mentor often calls to check on me and Tamir to make sure we are okay. The Family Friends program is my support system. I have been in the program since Tamir was 8 years old. Tamir is doing okay, I guess. He just graduated from high school. He has asthma, but has not had an asthma attack in a while. Tamir still faces challenges with hearing, and he has hearing aids. His hearing aids cost about $2,000. He just got a small job at Walmart, which is good, but I'm working with community legal services to make sure that he can keep his disability benefits. He still has challenges, even though as a teenager, he thinks he's okay. He doesn't get sick as often anymore, which is a good thing. Sometimes he acts like he cares about me, but sometimes he acts like I'm his worst enemy. It can be isolating. I am able to go to therapy once a week, meet other older ladies. We talk and laugh together. That is my fun. During the pandemic, my iPad was the only way I communicated. There was nothing else I could do. I went from iPad to laptop to cleaning my house and kept myself busy. Now I'm starting to go outside and do activity. Taking care of kids make me feel loved. I feel somebody loves me. It gives me a sense of purpose. Even though it's very hard, I enjoy it. It is very dangerous for kids out there on the streets. I do my best. I do the best that I can to keep Tamir safe, and I am proud of myself for raising him.
Ms. Stevens, thanks for your testimony, and I think what you've testified to today is emblematic of the sacrifices that so many families have undertaken for their grandchildren, but also for all of us, and we're grateful you're willing to share that story with us. I wanted to start my questions with you. If you don't mind, I'll either call you Ms. Stevens or Ruth, but I hope either is appropriate. But I'm grateful for the story, and I also am grateful you're willing to share the reality of it, the challenges that you faced. I can't even imagine when I was 50, a long time ago, but when I was 50, just beginning to raise a child who I guess you said was 8 weeks old, or even being part of that as a team with my wife, I can't imagine the challenge that alone presented to you. But we're grateful that you talked about the Temple University Intergenerational Center's programming to support you and to support other families. You also noted the pandemic brought all programs online, as we all experienced, and that you have not had the opportunity to connect with other grandparents who are caregivers in a personal way over the course of the pandemic. Could you share with us why it's important for you to be connected to other grandfamilies, other grandparent caregivers, and programs that support grandfamilies as you age and as Tamir progresses?
Well, it's helpful because, first place, I don't know what to do any more than what I'm doing, and I feel that with help, he could get something that he's not getting. He don't have a male role model or anything, and it's not too much that I can actually tell him. So it would be helpful to be able to have resources where he could connect even so more than me. Mm-hmm. So that would help me.
Well, you know, as I was noting in your testimony when you talked about raising him gave you a sense of purpose.
Yes.
And it's remarkable when you consider what you and so many others in this, as part of this panel, have either experienced personally or know a lot about. The idea that one person can provide love and care and support to one child or more than one, as the case may be, that alone is a substantial contribution to American life. But when you combine that with the benefit to the rest of us, because you, out of an act of love and responsibility, really duty, took on this responsibility, you saved a lot of us from having to expend other dollars that we would have had to spend. So it's pretty rare in life when you can help one person, but also help a lot of other people by extension. So we're grateful that you're willing to share that. I wanted to turn next to Donna Butts and ask about the impact of the pandemic. We keep referring to that, obviously, the devastation that caused, and so many people lost in the pandemic. We also know that caregivers and their loved ones are, as I mentioned to Ruth Stevens, isolated, dealing with trauma without adequate support or services. I think Congress has a responsibility to respond to this part of the larger tragedy of the pandemic, to make sure that no family goes without the mental health care they need, in addition to other supports. That includes, obviously, grandfamilies, both those who are struggling before the pandemic and those grandfamilies that formed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd ask you, Ms. Butts, how can Congress better support the mental health of grandfamilies, both the caregivers as well as the children?
Thank you, Senator Casey. And as I think you learned from Ms. Stevens and Ms. Engel, one of the things that's really important to grandparents raising grandchildren is to know that they're not alone. So those support groups, access to mental health services provided by people who are informed by trauma and know what the special needs are of the family are really, really important. So supporting services that are community-based and informed by the caregivers themselves to make sure they're relevant. Making sure that we're using federal resources that are available, like the National Family Caregiver Support Program, to provide support groups, respite, counseling, things that are there and that can be used. It's also making sure that mental health services are accessible to families using Medicaid and CHIP. And I think one thing that we are very excited and supportive of is the Supporting Wellbeing and Mental Health of Grandfamilies Act, which includes extending the Federal Advisory Council supporting grandparents raising grandchildren, and realizes that one of the things that's changed since that panel was first established is COVID and the impact of COVID-19. So we need to be able to dig deeper into the impact, because we're only skimming the surface at this point, and we need that council to be able to look, make recommendations, and be informed by the impact of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimonies this morning. And certainly, Ms. Stevens, thank you for your commitment to Tamir, who I believe is behind you. And I will say, as the kid who moved into my grandparents' house at 7, that I didn't always appreciate the sacrifice of my grandparents. The truth is that it takes time and age before you can look back with 2020 vision and say, my gosh, how blessed was I? And so sometimes you love them, sometimes you don't love them. We're talking about your grandparents, but the truth of the matter is you always love them. You don't always express it well. And so I'm sure that Tamir and I have that in common. I'm sure that he loves you beyond recognition and appreciates your sacrifice. Frankly, the fact that you have 10 other kids that weren't your kids, that you were able to help, not only help along the way, but you helped them graduate from school as well, which is a testament to your sacrificial love and support of your community. And we need more examples like that. If each one would reach just one, not 10, but just one, our country would be certainly better off. So thank you for your sacrifice. You did touch on the topic of resources and the importance of finding support groups and support systems. And I'd love to talk for 1 second with Ms. Clifton about the importance of legislation that may provide more resources. Certainly the CCDBG grants that come through the Reauthorization Act that for the first time makes kinship care families and children with parents over 65 eligible for support regardless of work or income requirements. Kim, I would love to just have you talk with us about the child care experiences in South Carolina from a grandparent's perspective and explain how this bill could provide more resources.
I think it's really important. One of the biggest challenges that kinship caregivers and grandfamilies face is finding child care. Often it's associated with the need to work, and caregivers are forced to quit jobs because they have to, they don't have child care. They don't have affordable, accessible child care. Of course, that was really exacerbated by the pandemic because even when caregivers can access child care right now, there are so few places open that have room. But because child care vouchers haven't been accessible by most kinship families, and they have a time limit of 52 weeks, it's been really hard. We've certainly worked with grandparents who have quit jobs because it makes more sense to be home with the kids because they don't have child care, and they need to know that the children in their care are safe, and it puts enormous financial pressure on these families when they can't work and don't have the alternative to keep a job because they don't have child care. So I think the enhancement, adding kinship families and the grandfamilies over 65 would be an enormous benefit to families.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I know Ms. Engel also is living the reality and the truth of each one reaches one. And so often we talk about the sacrifices of the grandparents when they're taking the grandkids, and that's certainly one perspective and a real perspective. I'd also suggest that it's an investment, not just a sacrifice, but an investment of the most important currency we have, the currency of love. And sometimes as I read scripture, it says love isn't just the emotion, it's the commandment. It's a commitment to do something, and certainly I think you have demonstrated that commitment to do something good on behalf of those you love. And I hope that when we walk away from this hearing today, we don't think of it just as from a sacrificial perspective, but sacrifice and investment leads to a healthier human being who happens to be related to you, and that's all good news. So I really do appreciate and respect your affinity for doing the right thing and for investing your life, your time, and your energy and your resources into your grandson's life. And to that end, I'm going to turn right back because I do like South Carolina, have affinity for my home state and the expertise that Halos brings to the table as it relates to resourcing. In the legislation introduced by Chairman Casey, myself, and Senator Young, the Informing Grandfamilies Act, it would require states to communicate with grandparents who receive or are applying for TANF, provide more information about additional supports. Sometimes we live in vacuums, and when we're busy taking care of our loved ones, we don't necessarily have the margin in our schedules to figure out how this complex web of resources actually work on our behalf. So to the extent that you could help us understand how South Carolina, through things like the Informing Grandfamilies Act, could provide more support to raising your grandchildren.
I think that would be an enormous benefit. Right now, often grandparents don't even know they can access TANF, and that can be very cumbersome trying to apply. We deal with many families that get rejected, and then we help them navigate the system and advocate because they are eligible regardless of income through child-only grants. But if they were given more knowledge about community resources, any benefits they may be eligible for, it would be great, because what we know is kinship caregivers and grandparents raising grandchildren, are less likely to know about resources even when they exist. They're less likely to have knowledge of them or be able to access them. So utilizing TANF is a way to provide resources for families, because many of them do access TANF, would be a huge benefit.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I know I'm basically out of time, so I won't ask another question, but I will prepare you for another question. I oftentimes think to myself that there is a system of social services for our seniors or for our grandparents, and then we have a separate system of social services for our grandchildren, who are the younger folks. And the chasm between the two might be problematic. So if we could figure out how to have a one-stop approach, it might be helpful as well. I'll give you a chance to talk about that in just a minute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott. We'll next turn to Senator Gillibrand, who's appearing virtually.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. During today's hearing, we have heard and learned about many programs and services aimed at helping families that are not set up to accommodate grand families or kinship families. These resources involve access to programs such as SNAP, Social Security, and others that can be life-changing for many grandparents across the country who have to navigate the challenges of childcare. Additionally, the complex nature of legal guardianship laws can lead to difficulties for grandparents looking to access these programs and to provide for their grandkids. Ms. Stevens, thank you so much for sharing your journey of becoming the primary caregiver for your grandson, Tamir, and for bringing him here today. While navigating this journey, what are some of the biggest challenges you've had to overcome, and what resources did you wish you had access to ease taking care of the role of caregiver for your grandson?
Well, some of the challenges that I had to overcome was getting to these places and finding the help that I needed. Can you repeat that again? Because I'm having no idea.
Just any other challenges that really speak to this hearing about things you wish were different.
Oh, well, I wish that I could have had more resources. I wish that I could have had a mentor or somebody to help him, you know, because I couldn't do but so much and still can't do but so much.
Yeah. That makes sense. Very much so. For Ms. Butts, through your work with Generations United, you've seen how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the challenges that grand families endure. In what ways can these proposed changes provide the support that's needed by grand families, especially emerging from the pandemic?
Thank you, Senator. The Grand Families Act will do a host of things to make the supports more available and stronger for the families. That includes financial supports like access to TANF and Social Security, addressing legal barriers by promoting guardianship laws to help grand families have the legal authority to make decisions and secure supports, promote collaboration by facilitating cross-sector partnerships, and investing in peer supports. And I want to emphasize the promoting collaboration because, as Senator Scott said, sometimes we have systems that don't speak to each other, and the new Grand Families and Kinship Families Support Network, the National Technical Assistance Center, is designed to facilitate those kinds of conversations. And we're seeing some beginnings of some blossoming relationships, some communication that we haven't seen before. So the Grand Families Act is going to really help the families, as well as some of the things that this committee has supported in the past. Thank you.
And based on what we just heard from Ruth, she said that she wanted more mentorship for her son, more technical assistance so she knows which programs have resources for her. Will those challenges be addressed?
Yes, in terms of promoting collaboration, and also in making sure that we're investing in peer supports. Because what we have learned, we're very fortunate to get to work with a number of grandparents around the country, is that being able to support each other, to talk with other people that are also walking the walk as you are, makes a real difference to have that voice. It helps inform policy, it helps inform practice, and it makes our communities stronger. So that peer support is very important.
Thank you. Ms. Engel, given your experience as a grandparent caregiver and as the founder of the Grand Family Coalition, to what degree do you believe the community-based organizations have been able to provide families with complex structures the tools and services they need to overcome the challenges that they're met with?
Coming into being a grandparent raising a grandchild is rarely expected or planned. It doesn't come with a guidebook because, like many families we need, are all different and situations are very different. What is really different is that we are unique in the fact that we have that we have an advanced knowledge of relationships to the parent and usually the children. The needs are never going to be the same, but because we are unique, being inclusive when referring to an aging population, it is considered that may have children which are not traditional things. When referring to a grandfamily or kinship, we may also refer to a sibling, raising a sibling, or an aunt or an uncle. Most importantly, the situation often leaves us without many services and the it depends and many other factors. We raising someone else's children, services should go to the children, as they are the ones who are having the abandonment. And yes, we would have been navigating a peer to walk with me through what if and what depends. I could have managed so much better.
Well, thank you, Madam, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gillibrand, thanks very much. We'll turn next to Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Engel, and Ms. Stevens, I want to start off by thanking both of you for being here today and sharing your experiences. I became a grandfather just last year, and I think it's very special that your grandchildren are able to be here with both of you today. I'm glad we're having this hearing today. This is an important topic. In my state of Arizona, there are about 62,000 grandparents who, like the two of you, are the primary responsible caregivers for their grandchildren. More than half of foster children in Arizona are placed with their grandparents or other family members, which is higher than the national average. This is encouraging because we know that kids do best with their families. But we also know that most of these caregivers are unlicensed and thus aren't getting all the support and services that a licensed foster parent might be eligible for. That's why today I'm joining Chairman Casey, Senator Young, and Ranking Member Scott to introduce the Informing Grandfamilies Act. And this bill will ensure that states are communicating to kinship caregivers and grandfamilies what additional supports and relief programs that may be available to them. You know, things like nutrition assistance or home energy assistance. So for the two of you, Ms. Engel and Ms. Stevens, thinking back to when you initially became a grandparent caregiver, would having this information readily available have been helpful to you?
I think some of it would have been useful to us, except for the barriers that I ran into is that I am not low income. And so many of those resources did not fit my needs. I did not have access to them because I was not involved with the child welfare system. I did not get services through them because I didn't qualify for Medicaid. I made too much money to get housing assistance or anything like that. I could have used some mentor myself. My grandson could have used a mentor. I could have managed to have someone navigate the system for me, the legal system. None of those things were available to me at all. None of the resources. And so it was a challenge and something that was very difficult for me to overcome.
It sounds like legal help and mentorship would have been helpful.
Absolutely.
Right. Ms. Stevens?
Well, I agree that both mentorship and for myself and my grandson would have been helpful to me because I was really struggling. I knew about all the TANF or Social Security, but I didn't know how to get it, and I couldn't get help to get it. So I didn't really get a lot of help until he got about 8 when I joined Family Friends, and they started giving me information and telling me where to go and what to do. So that's how I got the info. And right now, any resource that I could get can still help me and would have helped me back then.
Yeah, sometimes navigating these federal programs are a challenge
Yes.
in of itself. Well, thank you, Ms. Stevens and Ms. Engel. I want to switch to a different topic here with Ms. Clifton. Rising costs, it's an issue that's impacting seniors across the board. Costs for gas and groceries, they keep rising. Rent is going up. In the Phoenix metropolitan area, rents increased 30% in 2021. And that's not sustainable for families, let alone families led by grandparents who may be on a fixed income. That's why one of my top priorities is to bring down the cost of prescription drugs that would help the budget. You know, because we know that so many grandparents would do anything for their grandchildren, and that includes skipping the medicine they need to put food on the table. So we can't let that happen. So that's just another reason why ensuring that folks can take advantage of their programs that do exist, like yours, is so important. So, Ms. Clifton, as someone who works directly with members of your community, I'm sure you hear so many stories about this. Could you share some of those with us and some of your successes when you've been able to connect folks with the services they need?
Sure. In particular with the prescription drugs, what we're seeing is grandparents continue to push their own needs aside, mental health, physical health, when their grandchildren are in need. So with rising prices, prescription drugs that aren't paid for by Medicare become a real problem. So what we're seeing is grandparents will just stop taking their own medicine to make sure that they can fill prescriptions for the children in their care. One of our family advocates and I were discussing this yesterday, and she said, speaking of cumbersome bureaucracies, trying to access Medicaid for the kids is often a real barrier. So before they are able to access Medicaid, they're trying to pay for prescriptions for their grandchildren and for themselves. And again, if they're going to lose one of those, and it's going to be for themselves. Even if we know grandparents raising grandchildren tend to be in poorer health, they're not going to access really vital prescription medicines, for themselves to treat chronic disease.
Well, thank you. Regardless of where I travel across the state of Arizona, one thing I hear over and over again is that the price of prescription medication is too high. I mean, it goes up faster than inflation, faster than price of gasoline lately. It is just too expensive, and it's up to Congress to do something about it. So thank you.
Senator Kelly, thanks very much. As I mentioned earlier, everyone's juggling hearings. Senator Scott had at least two this morning. I might have a third I'm not aware of. But Senator Braun joined us this morning and as part of the hearing, and I'll now turn to Ranking Member Scott for a follow-up question from before.
Certainly one of the things I'd like to point out that Ms. Stevens has I think, said very well is that when you're taking care of your grandchild who has special needs, the transportation conundrum is incredibly important. And that's something that, as we think through the future of our acts that we want to pass, perhaps we take a serious look at the transportation conundrum that you have talked so clearly about. I want to give Ms. Clifton an opportunity to answer the question that I was starting to ask as it relates to the silos of consciousness, streams of consciousness. One is for our seniors from a social service delivery system. One's for those grandkids or for younger folks. There's a bridge that needs to be built between the two, and perhaps you might illuminate how we get there, perhaps.
I completely agree with you, and enjoyed hearing what Ms. Butts said earlier about collaboration. I think that in general there's a lack of collaboration between systems, but you're absolutely right. The child welfare system doesn't really speak to systems that help the aging. I would even say, again, we're very fortunate to have our local area agency on aging that does support grandparents raising grandchildren, but even so, we don't always think about when we're working with grandparents the other ways that AAA could help them. We're focused on the family unit and them raising their grandchildren. So I think that there are a lot of ways to build bridges between these two that would really illuminate and help, because I think in general the child welfare system doesn't do a good job of addressing the needs grandparents have that are specific to an aging population, and it would be a great benefit to see more collaboration.
Thank you very much.
Ranking Member Scott, thanks very much. I know we're awaiting another senator for questioning, but I wanted to pose a question to Ms. Engel. on the subject of grandchildren with disabilities, obviously there's so much work we've got to do in the disability space generally, but in the context of grandchildren and coming through the pandemic and so much else, you said in your opening that you made reference to the educational needs of your grandson who has multiple disabilities. And you said, quote, "Our school systems are most often ill-prepared with specialized training in support of these youth," unquote. You also talked about the challenges of securing services for him from his school. As you assume responsibility for your grandson, what information would have been available for you regarding school services?
Because I had the smarts to get my daughter to sign a delegation of power, I was able to get my grandson enrolled into school, to visit the doctors, to get vaccinations, so I was good there. It was after being told that my grandchild, through the kindergarten teacher, that I needed to educate him in order for her to teach him, I was a little overwhelmed. Teaching him and being able to having him kicked out of school many times over and over. I didn't learn about an education plan. It was then that I learned how ill-prepared our schools are for handling children with trauma and mental disorders. There is trauma-informed and there is trauma-respective. Our school systems do not have the latter. Grandparents are ill-prepared to even understand the trauma is how to parent them, no more than the school system does. The school did not understand it, know how to identify it, let alone how to deal with it. There are very little programs for children with mental disorders. It took me 9 years to find the programs for our grandson that works. And it was a deep, dark secret, and it was understaffed and unsupported. Our school systems are not prepared to handle children with mental disabilities.
Ms. Engel, thanks very much for your answer. We'll now turn to Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Casey. Appreciate you, Ranking Member Scott, as well. And I really want to extend a special thanks to the witnesses for being here today. You know, in the United States, over a quarter of Latinos and nearly a third of Asian Americans live in multi-generational households. Such households are particularly common in Nevada, where Latinos make up nearly 30% of our state's population, and we have one of the fastest growing AAPI populations in the country. So more than half of lower income adults and 45% of middle income adults report that caregiving is one of the reasons for living in a multi-generational household. So as the cost of childcare and other kinds of caregiving continue to increase, the number of multi-generational households will likely continue to increase as well. So Ms. Butts, what trends can you tell me that you're observing among grandparents living in multi-generational households in diverse states like Nevada? And how do you think the pandemic impacted the grandparent caregivers living in those households more specifically?
Multi-generational households are on the rise in our country, and they're on the rise to stay for a number of reasons, as you just pointed out, whether it be need to provide care for children or for older adults, to pool resources, and it's a strength in our family. With grandparents living in multi-generational households, oftentimes those are skip generations households, and they don't have the combined access to resources or the combined resources that other households have. So the grandparents have been isolated because of COVID-19. When we were told as older adults to stay away from children, they couldn't stay away from children. They needed to provide that care. There was the children that were afraid because they didn't want to infect their grandparents. There was all of a sudden everybody needed to be able to go online, and they may not have had access to internet or equipment. So the pandemic has had a tremendous influence, and which is why we also are supporting extending the life of the advisory council and taking a deeper dive into the impact of COVID and what can be done to support families, grandfamilies that have been impacted especially hard by COVID. Thank you.
Thank God. I'll look forward to that report because we want to see what Congress can do to continue to provide resources for these core caregiving duties. And you touch a little bit about mental health concerns, particularly for the pandemic, but for children living with their grandparents. We know we're in the midst of a youth mental health crisis worsened by the pandemic. 2/3 of teens, they've expressed feeling down, hopeless, depressed during the pandemic, and more than 200,000 children have lost a parent or primary caregiver to COVID-19 because sadly they passed away. And so these children may be living with grandparents or other family caregivers, and they're just going to require additional mental health resources, not just now, but most likely into the future. So Ms. Engel, could you speak to some of the challenges that children who are part of grand families may face in losing a parent or primary caregiver, whether it's due to the pandemic or something else, and how that trauma can affect the children and their grandparent caregivers?
Well, I will tell you that I support over 100 and some grandparents in my organization. Every one of them struggles. The pandemic was just an added situation. When a child loses his parent, him or her loses a parent, that is a connection that is made at birth. And once that connection is lost, it becomes a trauma because they don't know where they belong. They don't know why they're in the situation. They take blame for themselves. The COVID just added on to that because they're isolated and they don't understand the situation. Most of the kids that I know that are being raised by grandparents also come with trauma due to some kind of fetal exposure, the trauma of losing a parent. It is impacting the mental health of these kids dramatically. And then again, with the school systems not being able to understand that, not being able to support them, these children are struggling. And it will also perpetuate onto the next generation, as it has with my family. My daughter did not receive the support she needed when she was in need of mental health. It perpetuated to my grandson, and now it will continue on if we don't do something about it.
Yes, well, thank you for that. I see my time is up, but I do want to say that particularly an impact of the pandemic or the loss of a parent, the grandparents have lost a child, the child has lost a parent. So there is family trauma going forward. A grieving family has to deal with while trying to take on all these new roles. And we need to really address this, our mental health workers and their capacity to work on these types of issues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Rosen, thanks very much. I wanted to say to our witnesses, we're having something we usually don't have, which is an expedited wrap-up today because of the votes. One vote was called about 10 minutes ago. So Senator Scott and I, the ranking member, will submit statements, closing statements for the record. But we want to thank each of you for your testimony today, for your presence here, and for your own personal experience and expertise you bring to these issues. And the word that kept coming to mind for me was sacrifice, the sacrifice of so many grandparents, grandfamilies to give love and support to their children and help the rest of us along the way. So we're grateful for that commitment and that sacrifice. The record for this hearing will be open for 7 days until next Thursday, June 30th, for senators who might have additional questions or statements for the witnesses. But again, thank you for your presence here today. Thank you for your testimony. The hearing is adjourned.